So today I want to talk to you about the different types of mesh manipulation that you can do and just generally how meshes and objects work in Blender. So for starters, we've got our cube. The first thing I'm going to cover really quickly is the difference between a linked object and a linked mesh. So we have just a basic cube here. We can delete the cube and we can hit Shift A to re-add it. I'm not going to be using the tool menu this time around, even though we do have the add a cube or primitives mesh options here. You may be using an earlier version of Blender. I'm just not going to use the toolbar for this lesson. Instead, I'm going to Shift A and I'm going to add an object from my mesh menu here. So I'll just add an icosphere. So to show you what linked objects look like, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate another icosphere with the Shift D. So if I manipulate this icosphere with Shift D to duplicate, it will not affect the original icosphere. But if I hold Alt and hit D, I can do the same thing. I can move it along the X. And now if I manipulate this one, it manipulates the second one as well. So I can manipulate either one of these and both of them will get changes. In fact, I could create a whole array of these things. And if I affect any one of them, they all get affected. But something really cool to note is that if you have two of these guys, you can have each one of them with different modifiers. So for instance, if I wanted to remesh this, maybe do some kind of low poly thing. Maybe I want to do like high poly and then make it voxelized or something later. Smooth shading. I can do a number of things with this. So maybe I want to take this one. I'll duplicate it. Now when I duplicate it, it does get the modifier with it. But if I change one modifier, it only affects that one. And that's because these modifiers are single user. And to demonstrate what single user means, if I Alt D again, and I try to apply this, it will say make object data single user and apply modifier. Well, that means that if I do apply this and I click that option, what's going to happen is now if I modify this, the others don't get affected. And if I modify the others, it doesn't get affected. Single user pertains to this single encasing object. So there are ways to make objects multi-user, and that is complex, and we'll get to that at a later time. And you have attributes that you can access in geometry nodes and shaders. There's all kinds of ways to connect object data properties and things. But for now, just covering our meshes, you can tell the difference between a duplicated mesh and a linked mesh. So now that this mesh has a modifier applied as a single user, it is no longer linked or duplicated. It doesn't have any similar cousins. It is unique. I can make changes to it and it won't affect any of the others. We'll go ahead and delete that for now. So now that we've done that, if I applied, for example, if I apply a material to the mesh, materials are something that do get applied at the mesh level. However, if you apply a material to it from geometry nodes, it's a little different. We'll cover geometry nodes. It's even more stuff to cover at a later time. But for right now, if I just take a material and assign it to one of these, and I go into material preview, you can see that in this mesh, this is the duplicated mesh, not the linked mesh. But if I come over to the linked mesh and I assign a material, they all get it, regardless of what modifiers they have attached. Except for geometry nodes. It might be different there. You have to apply it in the geometry nodes as a node. So it really doesn't matter what modifiers I could have. I could have a displace modifier on one of these. But the displace modifier is a little different. It actually allows you to use a texture. Oh, it's already doing weird stuff. So it allows you to use a texture to create effects. I wonder if I can... I'm not exactly sure why. It's behaving like that. I've never seen that before. I don't know what to make of that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Yeah, I'm going to have fun with this later. But nevertheless, you can have some really cool displacement, but it only affects that linked mesh. If I make changes to another mesh and I have my on cage, turn these on. If I turn on the edit mode viewing, and then I come over and I modify one of these other objects, you'll be able to see the final result with your modifier stack still working. So you can mess with the primitive in edit mode while the other one is in, its final mode, its object mode. So that's cool. We can go ahead and get rid of that. So what's the difference between a linked object and a linked mesh? Well, if I take a cube, and I take another cube, and let's say I want to create an arch between these two. Well, an arch is actually not that difficult to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select both of these. I'm going to join them. So now they're one linked object, but they don't have linked meshes. So you know a mesh is linked if you come over to an object and you hover around a vertex and you hit L. That'll select all the mesh that's actually linked. It's a mesh island. And to demonstrate what an island is, if you come over to UV editing, this right here is an island. If I select everything, you can see that I have an island, and you can't really see the other because they have the exact same geometry. But if you select one of the islands and shrink it down, you can see there are actually two islands right here. So each one of these objects represents its own UV mesh island. So we'll go back to modeling for now. So now that we have both of these selected, I could try a couple of operations, but I think what I need to do is specifically select these faces. If I hit Control E with the faces that I want to bridge between, I can try bridging edge loops, but I'm going to run into an issue. Now, this modifier, this operation, has a couple of issues. If you notice that your bridge between the two cubes gets, I don't know, funkified, I don't know what you want to call it, sometimes it happens, and then sometimes it happens in an unexpected way. If I twist this list just a little bit, and then I select these two, yeah, let's see if we can make it misbehave. Now it wants to behave perfectly, no matter what I do. Okay. Well, that's great. In any case, so now that we've applied our bridge, if you do run into a situation where your bridge between your edge loops is jacked up, just try selecting this edge loop right here that you originated. And if you select it and you angle it towards the other, and if you just hit R and rotate, you'll rotate from your current perspective. Rotate it towards the other edge loop and it will bridge better, trust me. But for now, you can tell that these are bridged by hovering over a vertex and hitting L. Now the whole thing is a linked mesh. So these are linked meshes, right? It is one unified mesh now. So that's the difference between linked objects that share properties or meshes and a linked mesh. So let's say that you want to create some complex geometry, and let's say it's something like pipes. Well, meshes are really cool because you can do quite a few operations with them alone. But in object mode, you can actually add other types of items, and that's something you might notice as well. You can't add curves if you're in edit mode on a mesh. All you can add are meshes. So you can add a curve, and if you try to add more geometry inside of edit mode on that object that's a curve, you can only add curves. So contextually, that's important. If you want to join two objects, one being a curve and one being a mesh, you can do that. But what you'll have to do is, what you may want to do is duplicate it so you preserve a copy. And then you'll have to convert it to a mesh, and then you can go ahead and grab that circle that I'm pretty sure I just converted to a mesh, go into edit mode, select all the vertexes, hit F, E. So now that I've done that, I can select the face from this and the face from that, join these two actually, select this, select that, Control E, bridge edge loops, and now it's one linked mesh again. But if I want to have a curve controlling a mesh, what you may want to do is you may want to parent the object. So you might notice that I went off on a tangent here about using constraints. And I don't think we're going to use constraints for the most part for these lessons, at least not for quite some time. Constraints can be really useful whenever you're messing with mechanical movement and you want to lock things into a fixed position as you move them around the scene. There are lots of ways we can do that. We can parent things to curves using an actual curves modifier, but constraints are really useful for a lot of things that we'll cover later. Unfortunately, right now, they're not going to be particularly useful to you. They're a little bit more advanced than I wanted to get for this lesson, so I decided to skip over them. If you want to see a lesson on those sooner rather than later, please let me know in the comments, and I'll go ahead and post something soon. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and move on with the topic. We're going to be covering curves. So you have your curve, and let's say you want to create something like pipes. Well, there's about a zillion ways to make pipes in Blender, but I'm going to tell you right now, the easiest way to do it is to create it with a curve and then convert it into a mesh. So if I come over to my curve data properties here and I come over to geometry, I can go down to bevel and I can just jack this up to like 0.1 meters. We're dealing with a 2 meter standard size object here. If that's right, 2 meters? Yeah, 2 meters. So now we have our round pipe, and I need this to be a mesh, not a curve. So I can right click, convert to mesh. Now, something to bear in mind, if you have modifiers attached to this, let's say I'll just use a remesh modifier. If I have a remesh modifier attached to this as a curve and I convert it to a mesh, that modifier gets applied. It's not forgiving. So you want to make sure that you only have modifiers you want applied before converting to a mesh. That way you have a nice clean geometry whenever you bring it in. And then if you want to go ahead, add your decimate or remesh or whatever, you can totally do that and preserve the integrity of your geometry when it's added. Then you can always duplicate for your linked geometry, mess around with different settings, see what looks better, whatever you're into. Do a little Minecraft stuff there, make yourself an arena. So now you have a general understanding of linked meshes, basics of how modifiers work. There's a couple other things that we can cover really quickly. One of them is, let's say you want to make rapid changes to certain areas of your mesh, or let's say you have combined properties or combined areas of a mesh that you want to maintain control of, but don't need selected all the time. So for one example, you could extrude along normals right here. And so now you have this little ring. Let's say I want to be able to select this ring to make modifications to it later without having to come in and directly select it. If I come over here and I create a vertex group, I can assign those vertexes. So now if I have nothing assigned, I can select it. Or I can deselect those vertexes if I have everything selected and I don't want to modify that ring. It makes it really easy to deselect things that I don't want jacked up. Okay, just food for thought. It's just a quick way of managing and editing your meshes. So we've done Boolean operations. I've showed you vertex groups. I've showed you some basic joining meshes and linked objects. So there's a few other things we can cover. And I think I've already covered the measure tool at length. So I think instead what I want to do is I just want to show you a couple of quick operations that you can do for your meshes to clean them up. One thing that you might want to do, if you're making text, for example, you'll have a couple of things happen whenever you're creating text. In your text data properties here, if you come down to font, you can change your font, and you'll run into some fonts that are just better than others. I'm going to go ahead and set some kind of Comic Sans here. And while I'm at it, down in geometry, I've got offset extrude. Oh, down here I've got bevel, so I can increase my bevel just a little bit. And then I'll increase my extrude just a little bit. And I can get some really nice effects going on here. I could even take this in sculpt mode and balloon text it out. So if I take this, I go ahead and apply the text, and I convert it to a mesh. Something that's going to happen if I go into edit mode, and let's say I want to separate each of these letters so I can do operations to them individually. If I select all of them, P, and then separate by loose parts, you're going to run into a problem. Now it's actually cut out the faces for the text. This might be desirable to you if you're going for that effect, but if you actually wanted all your text joined, then you'll have to Control Z. And instead of separating by loose parts, you could separate by selection or material. So if I wanted to, I could come over and I could set an individual material on the T. And I'll have to actually go into wireframe mode. This is already taking too long, I can tell. There we go. Finally got it all selected, and I can come over here, add a material, and assign those selected vertexes. So now just these vertexes are assigned to this blank material. Go ahead and assign it, put something on it. Unfortunately, it actually assigned the material to everything because it had no base material. So I can invert my selection, create a new material, assign it to that, and now I don't have to worry about it. But then I'm going to have to go through and I'm going to have to assign a different material to each letter so they're all separate. And that can actually get kind of tedious doing it that way. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to Control Z a few times. So I still have this issue where the mesh islands are separated. What I want to do, because I know that the vertexes, if I look really closely at the vertexes, I can see that they're actually paired up. They're lined up alongside each other. And I'm not sure why this operation works this way, but you can see the vertex there. It's actually lined up to its partner very closely. That's great, because if I come up here to, well, I'm going to select everything first. If I come up here to Mesh, Clean Up, Merge by Distance, even if the distance is very, very, very tiny, it's still merged 2,000 plus vertexes. So now if I deselect everything, P, by loose parts, now each letter is a separate object without losing its shell. Perfect. And then I can run individual operations, or I can quickly assign materials to each one of these guys very quickly, just bang it all out. And then I can, make this one red, pink, whatever, make this one yellow, this one green, and then this one can be blue. And that's pretty cool. That's just a really quick way of creating text, converting text into meshes, and then dealing with those extra operations of just merging the vertexes really quickly. It's almost no effort if you know the process, and then it's easy to just finish up. So now that we've done that, there's a couple of things that we can do to our meshes to make them more performant. But just so you know, if you're messing with meshes and you notice that you're bogging, if you check down here, you have some statistics that appear on your what is this called? Your status bar. So what you can actually do is you go to Edit, go to Preferences, and if you go to System, I believe it's just, is it System? No, it's not. It's Interface. There we go. And then you go to Status Bar, and then you have your scene statistics. But you can also put your scene statistics right here in the viewport. If you come over here to your overlays, you have statistics right here as well. And faces and poly are pretty much the same thing. Currently I have 4,689 faces of the 16,000 selected. That's the T that I have selected here. If I select nothing, then it just shows you the overview of all of the different properties. So that's pretty cool. And if I decided to decimate, I could reduce that down some, but I'm not going to do that right now. That's the modifiers. That's in the next lesson.